Welcome back to Musicians Edition. Today we're going to look again at Mitchell Peters' Intermediate Snare Drum Studies. Today we're looking at Etude Number 4. Okay? So in this etude we get a little bit of everything except for rolls. There are no rolls in this piece, but other than that we get just about everything that we've talked about up to this point combined into one nice, neat etude. The first thing to talk about is a few rhythms. Okay? So in this piece we have a few eighth rests, right? So remember, eighth notes get half of a beat, right? We count those as 1 and 2 and an eighth rest. Gets the exact same amount of time, but just in silence instead of sound, okay? So whenever you see an eighth rest, just think 1 or and, right? Half of a beat and just let it go by without playing anything, okay? We also see 16th rests, right? Now the difference between an eighth note and a 16th note is that an eighth note has one flag, right, or one beam across the top. 16th notes have two, right? That's how we tell the difference between eighths and 16ths, okay? The same applies to the rest. So an eighth rest is kind of a slash or like a diagonal line with one flag across the top, right? 16th rest is that same diagonal line with two flags across the top, right? So when we see a 16th rest, we're thinking 1 E and right? One of those, right? When we see an eighth rest, we're thinking 1 or and, okay? All right. Then we have some quarter rests, right? The space of a quarter note, 1 beat. Very good. When you see two 16th rests back to back, you just give it the space of two 16th notes, right? That should be fairly obvious there, right? Very good. That happens a couple times here. It could also be written as an eighth rest, right? It would mean the same thing. Sometimes it's a little easier to read if you see both 16th notes, such as in this situation where it's in the middle of a beat, okay? All right, moving along here. We have one that's a little bit tricky, which is a dotted eighth rest. So it's an eighth rest with a dot after it, right? And remember, anytime that we see a dot after a note or a rest, we're taking half of the original value and adding it on, right? So if we think about an eighth rest, how long does that last? Half of a beat, right? What's half of a half? A fourth, right? Or if we're thinking in terms of notes, it would be 1/16th note, right? So now we're looking, we add that back to the eighth note, or the eighth rest, excuse me, and that gives us 3/4 of a beat, right? Or if we're thinking in terms of notes, that would give us 3/16th notes worth of time, okay? So whenever we see an eighth rest with a dot, we're thinking 1 E and, right? And then there's 1/16th note left after that, okay? Same idea when we see a dotted eighth note, right? We're thinking the space of 3/16th notes, right? 1 E and. Or in the case, one that you have on the third line from the bottom, you have a 16th rest on the beat, and then we play on E and then hold for the rest of the beat, right? So it'd be rest E and, right? Rest E and, okay? So the first rhythm we need to talk about here is a dotted eighth note followed by a 16th note, all right? So when we see a dotted eighth note, again, we're thinking the space of 3/16th notes, right? And then we see a 16th note after it, we're gonna place it on the 4th 16th note, right? So we're holding for 1 E and then playing on all right? So whenever I see that, such as in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th measure, right? You see a dotted eighth note with a 16th note after it, I'm thinking 1 E and right? 1 E and 2 and, right? 1 E and 2 and that applies every time you see that rhythm, right? Dotted eighth note with the beam connecting it to a 16th note, right? 1 2, right? Very good. Another one of the tricky rhythms comes in measure 3, right? Where we have a 16th rest on beat 2, and then we play 2 16th notes, then we have another 16th rest, right? But if we think of it in terms of 4 16th notes, we don't play 2, we do play E, we do play and, we don't play right? So that turns into 2 E and right? In the next measure, we have a rest on beat 1, a 16th rest on beat 1, and then we play the rest of the 16th notes in the measure after that, right? So this is measure 1, 2, 3, 4, right? We play rest E and 2 E and Very good. Now if we look 3 lines from the bottom, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of rests here, which will be good to talk through before we get to the beginning of the piece, right? So third line from the end, right? we have a quarter note and then an eighth rest on beat 2, right? It's an eighth rest because it has one flag, remember, right? So we play 1, rest, and then we have an eighth note and 1, right? And then in the second measure of the third line from the bottom, we have a dotted eighth rest on beat 2, right? Which, remember, is going to be the space of 3/16 notes, right? So we're thinking 2, E, and are all a rest, right? And then we have a 16th note at the end of the measure. So it's going to tell us to play on right? So 2, E, and 1, right? Rest, E, and 1, okay? Then in the third measure here, we have a 16th rest on beat 2, and then a dotted eighth note right after it, right? So it's going to be rest, E, and right? Rest, E, and then we have our dotted 8th, 16th rhythm that we already talked about. 1, 2, and then we have an eighth rest, and then an eighth note, right? So rest and 2. Next measure. This is the last measure of the third line from the bottom. We have a 16th rest on 1, and then we play a dotted eighth note right after that, right? So we're thinking rest, E, and right? That's the same rhythm we had a few measures ago, right? Just on beat 1, except earlier it was on 2, right? So we have rest, E, and 2, right? And then we continue on from there with stuff that is fairly familiar now that we've seen those rests, okay? All right, very good. Let's the last thing we need to touch on before we can play this piece are dynamics and accents, right? So just glancing through the piece, at the beginning we start forte. In the second line we jump down to mezzo piano. Then we have 2 measures of forte again, and then mezzo piano, and then forte, right? So we're back and forth there, right? With no crescendo, decrescendo, we're just jumping from all the way from forte down to mezzo piano, back to forte, down to mezzo piano, okay? And then looking ahead here, 4 lines down, we have a decrescendo that takes us from forte to piano gradually over the course of 1 measure, okay? Then we hang out at mezzo piano for a while, then we crescendo from piano back to forte using a whole measure of 16th notes to do that, okay? And then we play that measure as forte, then we drop it back down to piano suddenly, right? And then crescendo back up to forte, and then drop it back down to piano, crescendo back up to forte, okay? And now we see a few accents, right? So in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th measure from the bottom, third line over, or third measure over, we have accents on 1, and, right? 1 E and 2 E and 1, okay? Then we have, after that, we have accents on 1, 2, and then E of 1 and 2, right? E, 2, right? 1 E and 2, okay? And then we have some other accents mixed in. So once we drop the dynamic back down to piano, we have accents on 1, E, 1, 2, right? 1 E and 2 E and 1 E and 2, okay? That's the idea, okay? So brace yourself, hold on for dear life here. We'll make it all the way through this piece. I'll talk you through it at a nice slow tempo. Here we go. 1, 2, and ready, and go. And 1, and 2 E, 1 E, and 2 E, and 1, and rest E, and rest E, and 2 E, and 1, 2, and 2, and rest E, and 2, and 1 E, and softer. 1, 2. Back to forte, rest, and 2, and rest, and 2, and mezzo piano, 2, 1, and rest. Forte, 2, and 1, and 2, and 1, and 2, and rest. Crescendo, back piano, E and 2 E and 1, and rest E and rest, and 2 E and 1, and 2 and rest, and E and 2 E and 1, E and 2 E and 1, rest E and 2 E. E and 2, 1, and rest, and 1, and rest, 1, 2 E, 1, 1, and 2 forte, piano, forte. Rest. All right, how'd you do? So one thing to point out, again, on the third line from the end, you see CRESC period, right? That's an abbreviation for the word crescendo, right? That's just telling us to crescendo up for those 3 measures until we see forte, right? A couple measures after that, you see DIM period, right? And that's telling us to diminuendo, right? Or to get softer over the next couple measures until we see piano. Let's catch our breath, and then we'll try this piece at a fast tempo. All right, here we go. Nice and quick. 1 and 2 and ready, go. 1, 2, E. 1 and E and rest, E and 2, E and 1 E and 2 and 1 E and forte. 1, 1, softer. 2 and 1 and rest, rest. 1 E and 2 and 1 and rest. Take crescendo. Crescendo. 1 E and 2 E and 1 and E and rest. And 2 E and rest. Two and 1 and 2 E and 1 E and 2 E and 1 1 and 2 and 1 E 2 1 and 2 and E and 2 forte. Rest. All right. Well, thank you for being here today, and I'll see you next time.